The most important transportation question in Wisconsin: who writes those electronic billboards? Our guest today isn't the guy that does it, but he is their boss. I'm joined by the Secretary of Wisconsin Department of Transportation, Craig Thompson. Craig, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jerry.
So have you ever wanted to kind of, pencil a little limerick that they can put up on I-43? Or
I've given a few suggestions from time to time.
Have they taken any of them?
No, but we've got some very creative people that come up with those.
That's fairly new in Wisconsin, use of electronic billboards. They generally are the same all over the state. Mm-hmm. How have they been received, and how adaptable can they be?
I think they've been received very well. I think, we've gotten more and more creative within limits. There's some that have to come up for review.
There's some Bible churches that have really clever ones on their signboards.
There's other states that have gotten a little more risque than we have, but, the more creative and the more engaging, the more people do pay attention to it. And the thing about those signs are they really do serve several purposes. One is we can actually add capacity to our system without adding more lane miles if we get people to know ahead of time. And it's not just those signs. There's Google Maps. There's all kinds of things now. Mm-hmm. But if we can get people to make different decisions and smarter decisions earlier, it can help with congestion, especially if there's clearing an accident or any of those sorts of things. So there's that. And then the safety messages that we put up on there are a good reminder to folks to buckle up and to not be distracted. So there's a lot of benefits to them.
So today we're going to cover transportation in Wisconsin from soup to nuts. And I think the electronic billboards is just one of those, people think, roads. Nothing has changed about roads in 100 years, right? But the reality is things change constantly. But before we get there, Craig, you're the Secretary of Transportation under Governor Evers, but you've been involved in transportation issues for a substantial chunk of your career. Is that not right? Yeah,
prior to this, I worked for a group that was called the Transportation Development Association. I was the executive director there for 16 years. And it was really a coalition of local governments, of transit systems, of airports, of ports, of contractors, of engineers, regional planning commissions, agriculture, trucking companies, really everybody from users and builders of the system to try to look at why having a good comprehensive plan for transportation is important. So I did that for 16 years, for 11 years, rather. I was wrong. And then the 16 years before that, I was with the Counties Association.
And transportation.
And transportation was a big issue there, too, yeah.
So did your day job change when you changed offices? Or is it the same thing?
No, it's changed. It's one thing to look at it from that side, but no, it's changed significantly. And it's been an amazing year, a little over a year now. And I will say that every single day I don't learn one thing new. I learn a lot of things new every day.
And I think at the tail end today, tail end of today's conversation, I want to ask you, you've been on the job for about a year. Hopefully you'll be there at least 4 years, maybe 8 years, who knows. Later on, I'm going to ask you, what do you want to be? Oh, yeah, Secretary Thompson, he was here when we blank. So maybe it'll be when we came up with haikus for the electronic bulletin boards. But let's start with a sort of a 30,000-foot view of transportation. How's the state system?
Well, I would say we have spent at least 15 years, to be generous, in a disinvestment mode, whether that's in our local streets, our county roads, our state highways, our interstate system, our mass transit systems. So we finally had a budget this last time. I think that I would say we didn't hand in our homework for a long time, and we finally did. So, but you don't see the results of that for a while. So the state of the system right now, at all levels, it needs a lot of repair. I think we took a step in this last budget. We got the locals some more money. We got more money into the State Highway Rehabilitation Program, which is fixing the 2-lane state highways we have. But those programs take a while for people to see those results. Mm-hmm. And we're going to have to continue with some sustainable funding and good planning to be able to start really improving the conditions that people are experiencing.
Put a little more money in the transit system, as I recall.
We did. We had hoped to put more in. Governor Evers had proposed a 10% increase. It got knocked down to a 2%. And we had also proposed to put in $10 million for capital assistance to be able to replace buses, and that got taken out. So I would say transit in this last budget was a little bit more of a disappointment to me. We've got a lot of work to do when it comes to mass transit.
Without, sorry to ask you about a statistic, how many people need transit in Wisconsin? How many people use transit? Do you have any idea?
Well, we do have different numbers. We've got 81 public transit systems across the state that range from Milwaukee and Madison and Appleton and La Crosse to smaller systems, paratransit systems and others, and actually a pretty robust system up in Bayfield and Ashland. But right now we have a metric that we measure that might get a little bit more what you're asking, Jerry, is about 55% of the state's population has access to transit right now. Mm-hmm. So that's a measurement that we keep looking at, and we think we need to do better, especially as we look out across Wisconsin and the aging of Wisconsin and folks wanting to age in place. There is a fair amount of our population that doesn't have access and is stranded without that because they might not be able to drive anymore.
Now, the current system, when we talk about transit, we always think in terms of metro buses, mm-hmm. but there are a fair number of rural transit systems in Wisconsin, are there not?
Many. When I say there's 81, when you think of how many larger cities we have in the state, we have 81 public transit systems. So a lot of them are much smaller, and they're not necessarily the full-on bus systems that we think of. They are paratransit systems, which are a lot of times vans and other things that communities put together to try to provide some options to their residents.
To your point earlier, and there was a study that came out just recently, early in February, that talked about the increasing elderly population, and where it's increasing most rapidly is in those rural areas.
Right.
So those are people that you talk about, people being stranded.
Right. In addition to public transit, which I was talking about, they ended up with a 2% increase. There's another line item that was in the budget for elderly and disabled transportation aids, and that specifically goes more to some of the human service, aging disability resource centers and some of the services they provide. And we were able to get a 20% increase for that. And so, we were very happy about that, but the need there is so great, we've still got a long way to go.
What about the industrial side of transportation? Are we doing well on rails, harbors? There was news this winter about a couple of our harbors getting hit hard by the weather.
Right.
What's the state of that end of the business?
Well, I would say one of the things we don't think about living in Wisconsin, living in the Midwest, we think we're in the center of the country. But between Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, and the Mississippi River, we have incredible access to water from the two Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. So for our agriculture industry, our timber industry, for a lot of others, a lot of goods move out through there. There was good investment in this last budget for harbors. We had a significant one for the Fincanterry enterprise up in Marinette. We also increased funding for some other harbor projects. This harbor assistance program we have in Wisconsin is fairly unique in the country, and it allows the areas, local governments that have that, to improve their dock walls and different things. So there was some damage recently down in the Port of Milwaukee and others, and so we're hoping to get some federal dollars for that. But we've got a ways to go. There's way more grants in there than what we have out. But I think that is an area that we've been trying to keep up on and doing fairly well. When it comes to rail, what a lot of people don't realize is most of that's privately owned. The Class 1 railroads, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, Union Pacific, BNSF, those folks that go through our state, they have been investing in that rail themselves, and they've been investing in a better clip in that than we have in a lot of the others. We do have a government program for when a rail line's abandoned, and the public officials deem that rail access would still be important to some businesses in those areas, that the state can come in and help rehab some of that. But for the most part, it's privately owned.
Last year, your department made a horrible mistake. You asked me to sit on a committee to study the issue of shipping from trucking to rail.
Intermodal, right.
Intermodal. Why they asked me, I have absolutely no idea. But that apparently is a concern, that there's really not a lot of places in Wisconsin where you can move those containers from trains to trucks. What's the status of that? Are we getting anywhere with that? Because that's a manufacturing.
It's a great point, because we have a freight advisory committee that you sit on, and that I think there's a subcommittee on intermodal that you looked at. And about 7 years ago or so, we lost our intermodal facility down by the Port of Milwaukee. Union Pacific moved on to other things. And if you look at a lot of the bulk materials we have, manufacturing, ag, and others, again, we could get those heavy materials off the roads. They could be moved more efficiently for the shippers. But that's not something at the Department of Transportation that we can dictate. As I mentioned, the railroads are privately owned. So what we've tried to do is bring together a lot of our shippers, meaning our agriculture, manufacturing, and other folks, to see if they can demonstrate to these railroads that they've got a critical mass in certain areas that we could get intermodal facilities up and running again. And I'm hopeful that pretty soon down in Milwaukee, I think we're close. And we're hoping to get a couple of those in other areas too, because it can make us more competitive.
Back at the harbor, you mean? Hopefully getting something going there?
Hopefully you're there, although we had one in Stevens Point in the center part of the state back years ago too. So it can be just road to rail as well for intermodal. It doesn't have to be at a harbor.
And as I recall the discussions on that subcommittee, a big challenge is not so much that we don't have the goods to ship out. They need to be able to balance the load. They need a load coming in and a load going out.
That's exactly right. That's what we've heard from the railroads. To make their economic model work, we got plenty that we can put on to go out. Our soybeans, our all kinds of things. Timber. They've got to make sure that they've got, because with other commodities, they can do it both ways. So to make this work, they need to make sure they've got incoming that's going to fill those cars as well.
Does that become an international issue?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we forget. I believe we're the leading exporter of soybeans to the world from the United States, and there's so many different areas that we are. So a lot of things that are originating in Wisconsin here are ending up in China and other parts of Asia and Europe and Canada and Mexico. So it is international.
I'm going to take a breath here and remind everybody that you're watching The Local Perspective. And I want to thank Wisconsin Community Media, our partner, and specifically the gang at Fact TV here in Fitchburg for making their facilities available to us. I'm talking with Craig Thompson, the Secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, about kind of the global picture. Let's drill down a little bit now, Craig, if we could. Recently, in the last budget, the governor and the legislature allocated some additional money for local roads. And I promised myself I would go through this whole program without once using an acronym. I believe you're calling it the Multimodal Local Supplement Program.
Yes, it just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
How long do they give you a class? You have to take a class in acronyms. $75 million, and we don't need to get into the legislative back and forth, but it's a one-time project, and you were pretty overwhelmed with the number of applications for that $75 million, were you not?
I really was. This is a one-time grant program the governor asked us to set up this way for all the modes, and so $75 million of funding available. We received over 1,600 applications of projects that were worth $1.4 billion. So,
ouch.
Yeah. So there was a bit more need than the $75 million. And I should mention, also in the budget, when it comes to locals, though, was ongoing revenue for general transportation aids of a $66 million increase, which is base building and ongoing. So that helps your folks maintain their roadways.
And they'll see that in the general transportation aid check that they get from you. Local road improvement grants, did those go up as well?
They did by a little bit, but then most of it now went into this MLS program. So this is more folks submitting for improvement projects, those more significant projects that they want to be able to get funding for.
Now, by the time this program hits the airwaves, in all likelihood, we'll know who those grant winners have been. You've probably seen some of the applications. What struck you? What struck you about them?
What struck me is the just how important every one of them was to their local community. There was so many of these applications that they had in some of the most sparsely populated areas of our state that they had all of the employers or a lot of the major employers in that area sign on. Some they participated, that there was public-private partnerships. But just reading through the stories and looking at what an impact each and every one of these projects could have in the different areas and the breadth of the proposals was, I would encourage people to look through those. It's really striking.
So there's kind of is there something we learned that we can take away from this and perhaps use again?
Well, I'm hoping if again, we had set up a one-time program, but what I had heard from you, as well as your counterparts.
I start rumors regularly. It's part
from
of the
your
job.
counterparts in the towns and the counties, was make it as simple as possible. And I think that's sometimes easier said than done. But our folks worked, and we came up with a 2-page application process, which is much more streamlined than the local road improvement program and what it's been. So I think that helped facilitate, just how many applications we received, and that it fostered these dialogues in the communities about joint applications among local governments, about getting businesses that utilize these and agriculture and others part of that. So I think we learned a lot, and I do think this is something that I hope that we look at about either incorporating into existing programs or creating a new program.
There was a lot of political discussion back and forth about should this all go for roads and bridges, or should this serve the entire spectrum? As it turns out, the program is available. Its name implies it, multimodal. Were there a lot of applications that were not roads and bridges? And do you have any sort of sense in your mind? What were those? What did those look like?
Sure. The vast majority were still roads and bridges, but we did receive others for transit and for bike and pedestrian facilities and for harbors. And so, I think what the governor really wanted to do and what we wanted to do was allow local communities to decide what's important to them. And in many areas, it was a stretch of road, or what we call multimodal, road and bridge combined. But in some communities, they looked and they said this harbor project or this bike and pedestrian project would be very, very important to our community. And I think, we also worked on having your members for the cities and villages review the applications, the same with the counties and the towns. And we wanted locals to decide for themselves what's most important in their areas.
By the way, I heard a few of our reviewers got their email saying, congratulations, you've won the right to review 400 grants.
Well, that's what you signed up for.
Yeah, and a couple of them quit, as I understand.
But I'll tell you, the ones that did it, that was really a public service, and it was a lot of work. But from what I heard from our people, it really went well. Once they went through and did all their homework and graded those, and then came in and got together and decided amongst themselves again how they wanted to set up the process for reviewing. Once they did all those things and were able to look at disbursement across the state, that it really went well.
Is there any talk in Madison about perhaps doing this again? There was recent stories about state revenues were coming in quite a bit higher than expected. Now, a lot of that, the governor said he wants to focus on education. We need to do something to help the farm community. But since we know there's, depending on how you count it, $1.5 billion of unmet needs out there, deferred maintenance on local roads, any chance we would look at doing this again?
Well, if you want to help the farm community, one of the best ways you can do is to improve first and last mile and bridges. So we're in there pitching.
Come on, I'm lobbying. But work with me. Work with me.
But there's a lot of human services and education and a lot of needs. And so I don't want to divulge what I may be trying to get at internal, but I think you can make a really good argument that if you're going to use some of that one-time money, there's a lot more need there that could make some really big impacts in communities.
Yeah, and I mean, getting products to market.
Getting products to market.
You have to use transportation.
Right.
Craig, let's kind of turn our gaze to the future now. First of all, near term, we talked about some of the damage to the harbors recently from some of the severe storms we're seeing. Most scientists will tell us, get used to it, you're going to see more and more of that. Highway 2 was washed out up by Ashland a few years ago. Is your department looking at changing how we engineer roads to basically toughen them up going forward?
What you're talking about, resiliency, is a topic that I guarantee you every DOT in the country is looking at very hard, and some are ahead of others. We've done a reorganization in our department to try to create a new division of budget and strategic initiatives that we can look at things like resiliency and connected and automated vehicles a little more intentional. But when you mentioned Northwest Part and Highway 2 up there, they have seen repeated flooding at some of the same areas. We have to, in those areas, we have to learn. We can't simply we can't be Charlie Brown with the football, right?
We know it's a problem. We know it's going to happen again.
Now, always engineering to the highest standard gets really expensive. So is there other treatments we can do? Is there other retainage things that is there others? Or perhaps we simply do have to. But, this comes down to a factor of money sometimes too. So we've got a lot of really smart engineers and planners and other people out there that are trying to look at this. But I guess it's a long answer to your question. But yes, we have to look, especially in areas where we've seen repeat incidents. We have to look at doing something different and figuring out the smartest way to do that.
There was an article that I read after the last flooding they had up there, where a federal grant program, not Wisconsin DOT, but a federal program, required the town, after a culvert had gotten blown out twice, the federal regulations would only pay for putting the same size culvert in. And it's, I won't use the word stupid, but why do we have to keep doing things wrong over and over again?
Yeah, and I think at the federal level, I've been at some meetings out there. They're starting to get that message too. Some of those regulations are changing. They're taking this seriously. But yes, it just doesn't make sense in areas that we're continuing to see the same weather issues to go back and be replacing that culvert exactly as it is.
Okay, so we talked about weather resiliency. What else is the department looking at? What do you see coming down the road 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? I mean, you're building 100-year assets here. What do you think we're going to have to start to change in addition to armoring the roads a little better to protect against weather?
Well, we are building assets that hopefully, constructed property and all that do last for 50 to 100 years. But we're also, our job is to move people and goods efficiently, right? So we need to be looking at, in addition to the physical asset that's going down, how can we be smart about the use of technology, whether it's connected and automated vehicles, whether it's other issues. Departments around the country are hiring more people that are into big data and data management and IT right now than we are engineers. And, we need to be on the cutting edge of looking at how we, build a physical system that we think can last, but we don't know some of the changes that are going to be coming down. How can we in the short term do some things that don't involve concrete and asphalt that help the movement of goods and people too?
What would that be? What would that look like? Because you're right. I don't think we can predict where technology is going to take us forward.
So, some of that I don't know, to be quite honest with you, but we are trying to look at, when you talk about connected and automated vehicles, for example, one of the things you'll see is truck platooning. So you have semis that will be connected and can go along in one. The savings really there is because you'll still have a driver, and at least for the near term in that back, it's not going to be driverless. There'll be someone sitting in there. But they save a lot on gas because they're drafting until they can disconnect, and then they can go longer. And you can set up.
And they're really, really close to one.
And we've changed laws so that they can be really, really close. Even short of
the record, I don't want to be the driver right in the middle.
There's a lot of us that are going to have to get comfortable with it. But even before we get to driverless cars, there's a lot of interaction, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, where we've got some intersections in the state now that the traffic signal can see if a vehicle oncoming, how much it weighs and how fast it's coming in, and if it gets into a dilemma zone, as they call it, that yellow will stay yellow a bit longer to try to avoid that accident there.
Okay.
Bus rapid transit for some of your cities that are looking at going into that. That is bus to signal technology that will allow the signalization to allow those buses to go through knowing when they're coming. There's a lot of technological advances that are coming that will allow us to help move people and goods better without necessarily adding lane miles.
Up in Fond du Lac, I was talking recently to the city manager up there. They have a system where their fire and ambulance drivers have an app that will tell them if a railroad crossing is blocked.
Yep.
And it will even program or offer them an alternative routing. And I know a lot of Wisconsin communities struggle with railroads blocking access for extended periods of time.
Sure.
And that doesn't even begin to touch on the whole driverless cars thing,
right.
The flying taxis, things like that.
Right.
Realistically, when do you think we'll see platooning of trucks? How far out?
I think you'll, I get a little hesitant to give you a number, but I would say within the next decade, you're going to see at least demonstrations of that in Wisconsin.
And what about automated vehicles? When do I get to drive to work and do the comics or do the crossword puzzle while I drive?
Technology is not going to be the barrier to that. Our ability at the political level to figure out the rules and regulations behind that and to get specs that other states have that are the same in markings, I think that's going to be the much bigger hurdle. And I don't know. That's a tall order.
Okay. And then the whole flying taxis, do you see that in anywhere near the near future?
Not terribly soon. I think we'll see those other things first.
The other things come forward. Great. Talking with Craig Thompson, the Secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. What are the next majors? We've spent a tremendous amount of time and energy rebuilding what I'd call the aorta, that system of interstates that come in from Chicago. What are the next ones that have to be dealt with?
And I think if you look at where the governor's focus was in the last budget, was really fixing what we have first before really looking at capacity. But overall, I would say our system is largely built out. But we've got interstates that are at the end of their life. That doesn't mean they need to be repaved. That means they need to be rebuilt, taken down, sub-base, everything. In those areas, we do need to modernize, and that's where you're going to see a lot of the next majors, I think. So in this last budget, we moved forward with the Highway 15 bypass around Hortonville, which has been very dangerous. We enumerated Interstate 43 between Milwaukee and Grafton. We moved forward with the north leg of the Zoo interchange, that part by Mayfair Mall, to get that done. And then the legislature added and the governor signed moving forward with Interstate 41 between Appleton and Green Bay. For those people used to going to Packer games, you've got 6 lanes and you're going up to Appleton.
I know where we're talking about.
And then you go down to 4 and then it goes back up to 6 again. So that hourglass, if you will, that part of that middle will now move forward. And we're looking at construction on that will be probably from 2025 to 2029.
Assuming funding is available.
Assuming funding is available.
Can we fund those majors and keep up with local roads and rehabs at our current level of funding?
Well, the funny thing is when we say current level of, the short answer is no. But even that increase that we put in for the highway rehabilitation program, now that we don't index the gasoline tax anymore, we begin losing purchasing power immediately. Because the way we fund the rest of government, income and sales tax, those are percentage based and they have growth.
Right.
Our gas tax and our gas tax and registration fees don't. So if we don't do something to go in and adjust that, we immediately start losing purchasing power as we're moving forward.
And that is something we need to have a lot more conversations about.
Yes, we do.
But for right now, for today, we've got a couple of minutes left. First of all, Craig, when you walked in the door, and you've been dealing with transportation issues the bulk of your professional career, shall we say, but what surprised you? What was the big shock?
The breadth of issues that the Wisconsin Department of Transportation deals with every single day. It's one of only 2 ourselves in Wyoming are the only 2 that have both State Patrol and DMV. Under the auspices of the DOT. But whether it's real estate acquisition or salt purchasing or drainage issues or DMV or State Patrol or, a lot of the issues that I would have thought of, there is just... we have about 3,400 employees, and we have a lot of really smart people that are doing, just a tremendous amount of diverse work every single day.
Well, and I heard you on a podcast the other day where you talked about Real ID, and it had slipped my mind that your department is what's going to help those people get that ID or not travel.
Well, it would be harder to, yes.
Because you can't travel, you can't take a commercial domestic flight without the little star on your license.
Right. That was a federal 2005 act, the Real ID Act, and now the deadline, we've had a long period since that passed, but October 1st of this year, if you don't have the Real ID, you cannot fly domestically or internationally without a passport or go to a U.S. military base or a federal building.
Do most of our license holders have Real ID today?
We're getting there, but most of us procrastinate. So we're not at the 50% mark yet. So there's a lot of folks. If you haven't gone and got your Real ID yet, go in. It's really not that difficult. If you do it at the same time as you're getting your new license, it's free. If you're doing it when your license is not up, it costs the same as a duplicate. But you just need proof of ID, social security number, and residence, and you can go in and get that.
I knew we would do this, but we're running out of time. 10 seconds. What do you want to be remembered for as the Secretary of Transportation?
That we came together with a long-term plan for where we want to go. I know we're not going to fix all of the conditions while I'm here, but we need to come up with a longer-term plan and some agreement on how we're going to get there.
Craig Thompson, Secretary of Transportation. Thanks for joining us on The Local Perspective.